In order for me to really know something, what I believe about it has to be the truth. But then we looked at the idea that there's more to it than just that. It has to be in some sense justified or warranted. So if Garrett flips a coin, and for whatever reason, I just really feel like it's heads. Like it's not a random guess. I feel it in my gut, and I say heads, and he says, "You're right, it was heads." Did I know that it was heads? We probably would say I didn't know, right? I didn't actually know. I had a belief, it turned out to be true, but it wasn't really justified enough to say that I had actual knowledge of it. And so there's something to how we believe what we believe, that there has to be warrant to it. There has to be a justification of some reason. And philosophers have largely thought of that in terms of either like abstract reason itself. So I can know 1 + 1 = 2 just through logic. I don't have to go check every object in the world and see every time I grab 2 apples that I have 2. Every time I put a rock in one hand and a rock in the other, it's 2. Like I don't have to empirically examine that. It's just reason, right? Something can't be both A and non-A in the same way at the same time in the same place. So I can't be both on fire and not on fire at the same time in the same way, right? And that's reason, that's just logic. But then there's what we learn from our 5 senses, which is like the empirical side. And so I can test things. That's what leads to the scientific method. I learn about the world through sensory input and empiricism. And those are the 2 main ways that we've tried to think about, like, how do we know things? And then we looked at the end of sort of the idea of the process of knowledge. So it can be hard to know with certainty that what we believe is actually the best explanation of all of the data in the world, because we never have all of the data in the world, right? We never have every possible piece of evidence there could be. So how do we know if we know? And to some extent, it's if we trust in a good process, right? Even science is done in a community of scientists, right? And to a large extent, there's always trust in authority. Like if somebody says, well, I believe in God because my preacher told me, a lot of, people will say, well, then maybe that's not a good enough reason, right? Authority alone isn't good enough. But a lot of scientists believe that E = mc² because Einstein told them. Like most scientists don't reprove every single thing that has ever been proven about science before. We always have a community of learners. We have rituals, right? If you're a biologist, you're going to have a ritual of how you sterilize your instruments, how you set up the microscope, how you store things in the refrigeration, right? There's process and ritual, and that's why when engineering firms lose an engineer that retires early, there's always a loss of knowledge because you can't ever get them to write everything down. We know things beyond just what we can put into words. And that seems a little more similar to the biblical idea of knowledge too. When we look in the Bible, God tells the Israelites to trust the right authorities, right? They're supposed to listen to God, but Adam and Eve listened to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. They're supposed to listen to the true prophets, but not the false prophets. And if someone tells you that something's going to come to pass and it doesn't, that's evidence they were a false prophet, right? Or on the Mount of Transfiguration, the voice says, "This is my son, listen to him." You're supposed to listen to the right authorities, and you're supposed to engage in rituals and processes. The Israelites knew God not just through words, but by enacting the Sabbath every week, and by enacting the Passover every year, and by singing the Psalms when they went to the temple. And these actions of ritual were part of how they knew. So this week we're going to move into something a little less abstract. We're going to actually tackle a specific topic. We're going to have a lot fewer slides, so hopefully more discussion. We did actually get some people watching online, and I've heard that I should try to repeat questions when I can because they don't hear you. They only hear me and Garrett. So I like this quote from Francis Bacon: "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." So we're going to look today at trying to think philosophically about the existence of God. So we're going to look at a few philosophical arguments for the existence of God, and we're going to look at one against the existence of God. And we're going to see whether they are proofs or whether they provide evidence. And what we're going to see is with philosophical arguments about God, it tends to be somewhat abstract. And so it's not really going to be about the Christian God per se, just whether something necessitates a spiritual power of some sort. So then at the end, we're going to loop around to something that starts to blur the line a little between pure philosophy and apologetics and look at more like logical reasons for believing in Jesus and his resurrection. So we're going to close with something a little more specific. So I thought it would be fun to give my son the task of trying to prove to all of you that God does not exist. And so he's going to start us out.
All right, so the problem of evil. This is the logical argument for why a lot of people think God can't exist. Not that he doesn't, but just that he can't. And it's not always purely logical. It can be very emotional. And this is the main reason why atheists are atheists in some sense. And first, I'll just walk through it and I'll kind of talk about the emotional side. And then we can kind of talk about what we think and why it could be wrong, or what we think about the logic of it. And then I can kind of go into a little bit more depth. But the first premise is that God exists and is wholly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. So, describing characteristics of God. But 2 is evil exists. And so, if there are no limits to what an all-powerful, all-knowing being can do, a good being always prevents evil as far as it can. Good equals that God will prevent or try to prevent evil. But as we know, God is all-powerful, so God prevents all evil that he can. And since he's all-powerful, he can prevent all evil. And so God can prevent all the evil that there is. That's building off of all the things we know. So God prevents all evil, number 7. But number 9 conflicts with the conclusion of it all, number 8, that there is no evil and there is evil. So how does this work? So walking through it all, we can know that this doesn't have to specifically be a Christian God, but we can look at it through a Christian lens, that there is a being of all powerfulness, all lovingness, and all knowingness that exists and wants the best for us. And yet we live in a broken and destroyed world in which people can have terrible lives, have terrible things happen, and just can't feel like there's a God. And so a lot of the times, if there's somebody of the faith who has their daughter or son get into a car accident and die, they can think, well, God is said to have a father-like relationship to all of us and to really be all-loving and know everything that'll happen. So how could he allow my son or daughter to die in a car crash? That's just, if there's an all-loving, knowing being, powerful being like that, you just can't really put those two together. And so I want to ask you guys now, what do you think are there any things that stand out that could be flaws in this, that as Christians we could say this is why we don't believe this and that God does really exist?
So number 5 says God prevents all the evil he can. Could you expand on that? Like God could choose not to prevent all the evil, or all the evil he can, is there evil that he can't?
Okay, so number 5, God prevents all the evil he can. That's using the all-loving with God, that if he is all good and loving, he will try to prevent all the evil he can. So that's what we draw from the all-lovingness. So to your question that is there evil he can't prevent, that's what number 6 comes in to say, that we take away, if God is all loving and good, he will prevent evil. And then next, we take away, if God is all powerful, he can prevent all evil. Then we put the two together to say, God prevents evil.
I think the nitpicking that I see is that the number 4 says a good being always prevents evil as far as it can. And I'm seeing that as an absolute in our definition of what good is, not necessarily God's definition of what good is. And you know, being an engineer, I don't do absolutes well.
Yeah.
Never say never. Or always, don't say always, whatever. But the idea that, I mean, number 4 seems to be coming from our perspective, very much so, and not necessarily God's perspective. I don't always know what his perspective is, but I can see that that's our perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there being an absolute, I hadn't quite thought about it like that, but I think that's a really good point. And something else is God's perspective on good, but also the flip side of that is our perspective and God's perspective on evil too, because we're just kind of assuming evil is bad things apart from us, but we know that we are also evil. So if we say, God, just take away all the evil so I can be happy, we're also just asking God to take ourselves away, because we are part of the problem too. And so God could just look at the whole world and say, well, I could snap my fingers and everything could be gone and I would solve your problem. There would be no more evil left. But that's not what he wants to do. And he is all good and all loving. And so he has a plan for us. And I think it's important that if we're looking at this more of a Christian perspective, you can look at the Old Testament, how they had sacrifices to atone for God's justice, that there was a perfect place, the garden, that we broke, and now evil has kind of affected the whole world. So God could no longer God could, like I said, take everything away, but God doesn't want to do that because he has a plan to bring everything back to what it was. And so you can think of how we do communion now to remember Jesus' death on the cross, and that's a very crucial part for the justice of God, how God could be just, allowing sinners to be with him again. And so that's one of the biggest roles Jesus has, is fulfilling the justice of God, and so that God can still be loving. And so you start to see some of the flaws in this, assuming God will just prevent all evil just because that's what he's going to do, and not assuming that an all-knowing being has some greater perspective. And to that end, looking at the book of Job is really eye-opening, because I think it really illustrates what I just said right there about how God's perspective is so grand and different than ours that we just can't understand what it would be. And I think the book of Job really illustrates this perfectly, because if you look in the old, so Job is a righteous man, one of God's most faithful servants, and he's very wealthy in his time. And the book opens by saying the Satan, which doesn't necessarily mean Satan, it just means the accuser or adversary. So it doesn't necessarily have to be Satan, but some angelic being asked God, well, you've given Job everything he could want in wealth and money and happiness, and he loves you, but does he really love you because he loves you, or does he love you because you've blessed him with all these things? And so God says, well, I'll take it all away then, and we'll see what happens to Job, my faithful servant. And so, as we know, Job loses everything. And to fast forward in the book, his friends come to reconcile with him, and his friends are very persistent that Job must have done something wrong to deserve this. His friends are very stuck in the thought that the righteous will gain and the wicked will lose. And so if Job has lost everything, Job must be wicked. But that's the point of the book of Job, is to rewire the thinking that the people and some people now have about that if you are righteous, God will always bless you, and if you are wicked, God will always curse you. And so his friends are stuck on that idea, and Job kind of sways back and forth. God is obviously still just, all-knowing, and loving, and can God really be that? And he just took all my children, all my belongings away from me. And at the end of the book, Job calls God to come down to him and explain to him why he has done this. And God listens and comes down. But instead of explaining the whole thing at the beginning with the Satan, God just shows Job his power and says, I'll show you all these intricate things of my world and this universe I've made. And can you really just think about how much I have to understand and know to perfectly take control over this entire universe I've created. And the fact that you think me taking away just everything I've already given to you makes me unjust, and that it's just kind of all centered around Job and his perspective. If you just take a massive step back and look at God's perspective, there's really just no way we could ever know how everything will be affected by what God does. And so we have to trust in God that what he's doing is the best for us and for everyone and everything. And I think it's a happy ending at the end of Job because he gets double that he lost. And the resolution is not that Job passed this massive test and God says, here, you proved that you love me just because you loved me from the beginning. Have all this. He says, well, Job, you love me because you loved me. And I'm going to gift you this for no reason other than I love you. And in my infinite wisdom, I see fit to gift you that. And so if we think the perspective of God, God will not always prevent all evil just because that's what a God would do. He does everything in his all-knowingness and all-powerfulness for our sake, so that throughout his plan, we can end up in the new creation without any evil and with him.
Good job, Garrett.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on probably to the first argument for God. But before we leave this one, I did want to say something about kind of the nature of philosophical arguments, because we're going to, I think of things in two different ways. So one is what this is trying to be, which is a proof. So to me, that concept is most like mathematics. I loved math. I think Gail talked about this in her last class. She loved geometry, because in geometry you do proofs. There's this article that these high school students, I think from Louisiana, recently came up with a new proof for the Pythagorean theorem that other mathematicians thought was impossible. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, the best PhD mathematicians of the world have thought this was impossible, and these high school girls proved it. And the thing about mathematical proofs is, if a mathematician understands it, they are convinced. If it's a true proof, you can't deny it, right? That's really hard in philosophy. And so what this is trying to be is a proof, and it is a valid argument form. So what that means is, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. The premises are basically 1 through 4. So if all of 1 through 4 are true, then there isn't a logical contradiction, and God and evil cannot both exist. So if it's a proof, you just have to find one exception, though, and then the proof doesn't work. But then the alternate, so I said there's two perspectives, right? One is it's a proof, and either it works or it doesn't work 100%. The other is, does it contribute some sort of evidence? Right? Like if it doesn't work as a proof, but I think there sure seems to be a lot of unjustified evil in the world, does that still contribute evidence towards maybe there's not a loving God? And we're going to look at some arguments for God, and you may feel the same way. Like maybe it proves God exists. Maybe there's a question, but is it at least evidence that the universe needs some sort of God to make sense? So yeah, Garrett did a great job walking through these. It's hard to know exactly where everybody falls. I think we probably would not disagree with number 1. Number 2 is actually interesting to me. I copied a version of this from an author I like, and he uses the word evil. Some atheists, I think, would not actually believe there is such a thing as evil. We looked at that last week with the logical positivists. If there is no objective moral foundation, if we're just a bunch of random atoms bouncing around that will eventually dissolve into the atoms in the heat death of the universe, there's no true evil, because nothing's right or wrong, it just is. But you could replace that with pain and suffering, and the argument still kind of works. Atheists all agree there's pain in the world, right? No limits to what an all-powerful God can do. That's probably true. Where philosophers start to object a little bit is like, could God make a square circle? But then is that just a nonsense question? Like, is square circle just not actually saying anything? It's just blah, blah, blah. Or is it a logical contradiction? And we say, okay, well, God can't do a logical contradiction, but he can do anything power can do. That probably doesn't weaken the argument very much. I think the weakest link is 4. So if we think of it as pain and suffering, not everybody in the room is a parent, but we've got a lot of parents. If you try to be a good parent, have you ever allowed your kid to do something that you thought there was a pretty high likelihood it was going to cause pain or suffering? And was that just because you were a bad parent, or could there have been some valid reason you might have allowed your child to experience some degree of pain? I think that's the weakest link. I think there could be a valid reason why God could allow suffering. We may not know what it is. And I don't want to ramble on this too long. I don't have a watch. Well, that time, I guess, works. I think Garrett's exactly right to point to Job, because I think that's the point of Job. A philosopher I was reading said that this is a little bit like, it seems that there's not a good reason for all of the suffering in the world. And so then the question is that seeming a good reason for me to think that there isn't a reason? And so I'm not a chemist or physicist, but I'll try to get the atom right that he mentioned. But there's two statements, right? One is, it seems that there is not a real live elephant in this building right now. So am I justified in believing there actually is not a real live elephant in this building right now? I think so. That seems reasonable to me, right? The other statement is, it seems to me there are no carbon-14 atoms in this room right now. I can't detect any. Is that a valid reason for me to believe that there are no carbon-14 atoms in this room right now? Probably not so much. Like, how would I know, right? Am I capable of understanding whether there are those atoms in this room right now? So which one is God's reason for allowing suffering? Is it an elephant in the room, or is it a carbon-14 atom in the room? And I think Job is saying, who are you to think you could understand God's reasons, right? Can you choose to keep following a God that you may not always understand? So I think number 4 is probably the weakest link in the argument. The first one for God's existence is the cosmological argument. And there are several versions of this. If you've heard of the unmoved first mover, that's kind of the original cosmological argument. Kalam is one that the modern-day philosopher, apologist William Lane Craig has kind of popularized. It comes actually from a medieval Islamic philosopher, and that's what Kalam means. It's like an Arabic word for scholasticism in the Middle Ages. But I think it's a good, simple version of the cosmological argument. So it's just 3 steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. All right, so this is pulling on the idea of sort of universal causation. If I'm walking through the forest and I see a beach ball, and I say, I wonder why that's here. And Garrett says, there's no reason, Dad, it just appeared. There was no cause of that ball being here. Like, would we accept that that's a possibility? It is an uncaused beach ball. Probably not, right? We went on a hike in Alaska in August, and we saw these mushrooms that I swear were straight out of Super Mario Brothers. Like, the big red top with the white dots. And so if Jaron said, how did that mushroom get here? And I said, oh, it just popped into existence 10 seconds ago. It was random. There's no reason. Like, right, we all think, well, okay, that species of mushroom isn't native to Alaska. It's been raining for 2 months. It just stopped raining. Mushrooms release spores, enough moisture, they germinate. Like, there's causes, right? We expect anything that exists, it was caused. It's irrational, I think, for us to assume something happens without some cause. Any initial objections to this one? Do you think it's wrong that if something begins to exist, it was caused to exist?
I think the thing we have to understand is that we don't have to understand the cause. We don't have to understand that
Yeah. I think the one possible weakness of this that I do not understand, if somebody in the room understands, let me know, is quantum mechanics. So there are some physicists who believe that electrons do things without a cause. Now, it's not that they begin to exist without a cause, it's more that they move in what statisticians would call a stochastic way. There is no cause for why an electron is where it is, it just appears. I don't know if that's true. Some physicists disagree. The majority of physicists today think that electron movement is uncaused. Garrett, you've taken physics. Do you want to comment on that one?
People don't even know if electrons exist anymore.
Okay. We can't see them. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
There's some negative probability around an atom. That's all that we know.
Okay. Thank you for correcting my weakness there. All right, this one is the philosophically interesting one to me because people have not always believed this. The universe began to exist. Some philosophers have thought the universe could be eternal. Now, I could really geek out with y'all on infinity right now. We talked a little bit about infinity last week, if y'all were here, and the square root of 2. I think it is, you should read a book called The Mystery of the Aleph. It's about the history of thinking on infinity. There were mathematicians that, when calculus was a new thing, you were either an algebraist or a calculist. And a calculist thought that infinity was a real thing, and algebraists thought it was an interesting concept but not real. And there were mathematicians that tried to get each other barred from teaching positions in universities over this disagreement. I believe that there cannot be, at least in our universe, I don't know about what heaven will be like. God can do whatever he wants to do. Within our space-time universe that we can understand, I think it is impossible for an infinite number of real, discrete things to actually exist. So there are paradoxes if you assume it. So let's say I have a book with an infinite number of pages, a real book in the real universe, and I'm looking at the cover. I open the cover, page 1, page 2. It has an infinite number of pages. Can I turn it over? You can't. There's no last page, right? If I tell you I will give you $1 billion once an infinite number of seconds have passed, seems too long? How about milliseconds? Right? I will never give you that money, ever. I think the idea that the universe is eternal means an infinite number of days have already passed before now. Like actual measurable units of time, an infinite number have already happened. And I think that's just a logical impossibility. Now, if we really want to geek out about it, the question is how did God exist before the universe? And philosophers talk about atemporal metaphysical time, and it's time that can't be divided into units, and it gets real weird. So I do believe in the conceptual idea of eternity, that God could be eternal. But if we can break space-time into discrete units like seconds, minutes, hours, days, I don't think it's possible that there could have been an infinite number in our universe already. So I think the universe began. As far as I understand it, virtually all scientists now think that it began, right? That's the whole Big Bang concept. I'm not aware of any modern scientists that think the universe didn't have a beginning. Okay, so if those two things are true, then that means the universe had a cause of its beginning. Now that's the end of the argument. It may not seem powerful to you, but the idea is whatever caused the universe to begin cannot be inside of the universe, or else we get back to this infinite regress of causes, right? Is there just cause before cause before cause? Well, there was the Big Bang, God caused that, but if he was something that was caused, like the universe, then what caused God? So whatever caused the universe has to be outside of the universe uncaused. And then if we start thinking about it, it makes sense that it would be something that could choose to create, some kind of will or intention, right? Something that's incredibly powerful, because the Big Bang is incomprehensible to me. If you think about what a black hole is, it's so much matter that it bends light inward, nothing can escape. The Big Bang idea is that all of the matter in the universe, which is billions and billions and billions times more than a black hole, was smaller than an electron at one point in time, and then blew outward. If that's real, whatever had the power to make that happen is more power than we can comprehend. So I think it's interesting to think about the idea that the universe came into existence, something must have caused that, and whatever caused that has to be incredibly powerful, chose to cause it, and is fundamentally different than the universe itself. It doesn't prove it's the Christian God, but it sure sounds like we need something kind of mystical and powerful. And so I actually think this is a really, really strong argument. Other than saying we don't know that it was God, I've not heard an atheist have a really good response to this. I mean, you could try the quantum mechanics, electron thing, and maybe there was no cause. The idea that the universe itself had no cause seems way more bizarre to me than an electron might be able to move with no cause. So if you buy the argument, the only thing you can say is, well, sure, something caused it, but I don't know if it was your God. Which, fair enough. We'll look at other reasons to believe in God, but I think this was interesting. All right, so let's look at a few more. The first one that I want to look at is the fine-tuning argument. So this is the idea that there are certain things about the nature of the universe that are just the way they are. And it doesn't seem like there's any reason they have to be that way. Scientists usually are referring to what are called constants in the formulas here. So you have a formula that says x equals 1.32 times y, or whatever. The 1.32 is a constant. It's not a variable. It's always the same number. So things like gravity have a constant. There's the gravitational constant. And what that is how powerful gravity is. We can't seem to figure out why the gravitational constant is what it is. It just is. We can imagine universes with a bigger gravitational constant and a smaller gravitational constant. Those are entirely logical. But our universe happens to have a certain gravitational constant. Well, what we know is, if the Big Bang is true, and if the gravitational constant was the teeniest bit bigger, the universe would have already collapsed on itself and stars and planets would have never formed. If the gravitational constant was the teeniest little bit smaller, all of the matter in the universe would have sped out so fast, stars and planets would have never formed. So it has to be exactly what it is for there to be any chance of life in the universe. And that's just one, the gravitational constant. There are other things about the nature of the universe that if they were the slightest bit different than they are, there could be no life in the universe. And so that's basically the argument, is why is the universe this way? It seems to have been designed to be this way. And I also think this is a pretty powerful argument because the only thing that I've heard atheists say in response is the idea of a multiverse. And I don't know if you like Marvel or not, and if you think the addition of the multiverse to the Marvel Cinematic Universe was a good thing or a bad thing, but our culture has a fascination with multiverses right now. I want to say, first of all, this is not science, it is metaphysics. So if there is a multiverse, no scientist would ever be able to detect anything about it. It is literally beyond what we could perceive. So it's not a scientific theory, because scientific theories have to be testable. You cannot test the existence of a universe outside of our universe. So it could be true, but we're doing philosophy here, right? We're not doing testable science. The interesting thing to me about it is there's literally no reason to believe in it other than this argument. It is scientists saying, it seems like the odds of this universe being able to support life are about a Google billion trillion to 1. So maybe there are that many universes, and we just happen to be in the one that can support life. And all the other ones, there's nobody there wondering why there's no life, because they're not there to wonder. So we just, we got the luck of the draw. We're in the one out of the billions and billions of universes that can support life. That could be true, but we will literally never have evidence of it, because it's just an idea somebody made up in response to this. I've never heard anything else other than that one. So you get a designer, or you get the multiverse. I think are pretty much the only two options on the table at the moment. Okay, we have very few slides, and I was going to try to encourage more discussion, so I'm going to pause here. The next one I think there will definitely be discussion on, but I'm curious if y'all have any, other than commentary on the Marvel movies, any ideas about this argument? Does it make you feel like this is a valid argument for the existence of a designer?
I don't know, but you see basic versions of that in a lot of the science fiction, where you have all these different beings that have evolved separately. There's an assumption that other worlds will have evolved into giant slugs,
right?
Whatever, and that we are just one of those. And so there are these at least alternate paths within the universe.
Yeah.
So it's an easy leap.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, right? I mean, it's an interesting idea. We love to imagine different types of realities. Yeah.
And that's basically the science fiction theme.
Yeah.
Is other worlds with other forms of life who all seem to walk, upright for the most part, except Java.
Yeah.
There's only so much Hollywood can do.
Yeah. So the thing about these arguments is I think relatively few people believe in God because of these arguments. I think they're still helpful because I think some people do start to doubt God because of what they think science or atheist philosophers or whatever are proving, and this can sort of be a buttressing of it. It actually is reasonable to believe in God. But I don't think that many people, and I think there are some, I'm not trying to be absolute, but I don't believe in God because of these, right? Like my mom raised me in church. I believe in God for lots of other reasons. The next one, I think, has a little more emotional pull to some extent. And I included it partially because I heard a guy on a podcast say that this is actually how he came to faith. He was a Jewish person by background, but an atheist, and he was thinking about one of my favorite books, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And so this is the moral realism idea. This picture is from Crime and Punishment. And if you've never read the book, he's picking on Nietzsche. So Nietzsche had this idea that because God is dead, what we need are supermen. The German word is like Übermensch. Supermen that are going to pull society forward by the brilliance of their mind. And what Nietzsche thought is that means traditional morality doesn't apply to them. In order to pull society forward to the next phase of development, we got to leave behind these archaic rules of right and wrong that religions put on us. And the supermen can do whatever they need to do. Hitler, by the way, loved Nietzsche's philosophy. So what Dostoevsky does is he creates this character in Russia that is taken by this philosophy. And he's a poor, starving student, and he's renting a flat from a little old lady, and he cannot pay the rent. And he starts to sort of go in on himself mentally. And he goes a little bit crazy. And he decides that because I'm a Superman that is going to intellectually pull society into the next thing, and I'm going to get kicked out of my flat, I can go kill my landlady and keep living in my flat. And what happens is he hides out in her flat, and when she comes home, she has her sister with her who is mentally handicapped. And he is surprised by it, and he kills both of them. If I remember the story correctly, I think they both die. So this guy was thinking about this story, and the idea is, what makes that wrong? What makes it wrong is that God has a purpose for our lives, right? Or that we're created in the image of God, that every human has inherent dignity and worth. We haven't gotten to ethics yet. I think ethics will be our last 2 weeks. But I think it is really, really hard to ground that in objective reality if you don't believe in God. If we're just a bunch of atoms bouncing around in the universe and eventually the universe is going to fade away, like I can feel bad about things, but does it ultimately matter? Like in a real objective absolute sense, is it ultimately wrong if one bundle of atoms messes up another bundle of atoms? All three of us here from my family have watched a show called The Good Place, and it's a funny show, and he's a good thinker, and he wrote a book that's sort of a funny Ethics 101, and he writes a thing at the end, the like epilogue of the book, that is like a letter to his kids that basically says, like, all these theories of ethics are interesting, and I hope you pick a little from this and that to lead the best life you can, because it's sort of hard to prove that one is right and the others are wrong. He meant it as this like really heartfelt letter to his kids. I found it profoundly sad, because he basically couldn't tell them one of these is true. Like he couldn't say there's objective right and wrong. He just said, I want you to lead a good life. I want you to think about all this, kind of pick and choose what you think makes sense and helps. And so the honest atheist philosophers usually end up at some sort of cultural relativism. The reason that murder is wrong is because we as a people have decided that it's wrong. It's bad for society. We don't like it. We're going to have social norms against it. We've decided that it's wrong. Other cultures do different things. It might be right for them to do what they do. And if you read Crime and Punishment, the question is, this guy bludgeoning a mentally handicapped woman to death with an axe, if every human on the planet one day decided that was okay, would it be okay? If we all decided, we're going to make an exception for this, it's all right, like, well, some things are wrong, but this one, we're okay with that, would that mean that it actually is okay? And he decided no, like that's just wrong. There are some things that are just wrong. And his conclusion was, it can't be just wrong unless there's something like a God that made it wrong, right? Unless humans have inherent dignity, it's not just wrong. But it has to be just wrong, right? Like that has to be wrong. And so that's the idea. It's like if there really is real evil, real right and wrong, which is actually an interesting thing. So we started with the problem of evil. I don't know for sure what the solution is to why there's evil in the world. But if there's no God, there's really not evil in the world. Like what Hitler did isn't objectively wrong. It's just something I don't like. So I think the problem with evil is a problem. But the fact that I think it really, really is actually objectively wrong makes me hold on to a belief in God more than reject it. So I don't know. What do you think?
Sorry. I know we'll get there, but
Yeah.
I know you guys like these thought experiments. I guess what comes back to my mind is like when all these were happening, the people who made them up, had they read the Bible, and what do they think about that? And then also, again, I know we'll get there, but the relationships.
Mm.
Like, you're doing thought experiments about kind of a big global story, but also like thinking beyond that. But what about the small relationships within it?
Mm-hmm.
That, because if you say, is it okay to bludgeon everybody who has, like, is mentally handicapped, what happens when one of the people gives birth to somebody who's mentally handicapped?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, so Dostoevsky definitely had read the Bible, because Dostoevsky and Tolstoy
Yes.
are two of the thinkers that really helped keep Christianity alive during the atheist revolution there. So yeah, I think if we go to that sort of like abstract proof versus evidence that pulls at us, it's the relationships that usually pull at us more.
yeah, sorry. Because
Yeah.
God ultimately says it's love.
Yeah.
But that's still not a word mentioned yet in any argument.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I guess we haven't said the word love yet. I feel like it has a place in this one, but I focused on its antithesis more than it itself. Yeah.
Love is this emotion thing.
Yeah.
But isn't it all emotion?
We can choose to love.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
can
I think
choose-
it's.
Yes, we can choose. And love is, to some, a very illogical feeling. It doesn't make sense.
But
And so, in the simplistic form, you tend to block out all of those things, or ignore them, or just dismiss them as, well, those are just human frailties, those are, weaknesses, or whatever. And there are some philosophers who really think they have divorced themselves from all emotion. And that, to them, is a badge of courage. That is a badge of honor, that they are amoral, or, they don't get messed up in the muck of morals. It's just too messy.
They're completely objective.
Yeah, that's the idea, right?
And they're only fooling themselves. But
Yeah.
when you bring love into it, it's like they don't get it. They don't understand it. They don't want to understand it, so they can't admit it.
But it's our definition of love that gets to be a problem, because we have so many
Yeah.
ideas that mixed in there. I love hot dogs. Well, that doesn't have really, but we say things like that.
Yeah.
Or we love our spouses, and so we're emotionally about it. But the biblical love is not that's not the focus of the idea of emotion, but rather a choice.
Yeah.
I choose to love my neighbor. I choose to love my enemy.
Yeah.
Something that is contradictory
Well,
to the idea of emotion.
It's imprecise. It's imprecise.
Well, and I said that I don't think too many people have been convinced based on these arguments alone. I think what convinces people is relationship and is love. And Garrett got at that a little bit with the problem of evil, right? Like there's the abstract problem that evil exists, but there's the real problem that I have experienced pain and suffering. And I think most people that wrestle with God's existence is because of the pain and suffering they've experienced, not the idea that there's evil in the world. And I think most people that believe that God exists, it's because they have experienced it through relationship and through love. So this thought experiment of, if everybody decided murder was okay, would it be okay, is an abstract thought experiment that I hope never gets realized. But there are real examples, right? So like I was listening, if y'all know Michael Gungor that wrote Beautiful Things, that song, You Make Beautiful Things. He's taken kind of a weird turn, but I love that song. And I listened to him years and years ago on a podcast. He's got a daughter with Down syndrome. And he talked about how many people said that you should abort the daughter because nobody would want to bring someone with Down syndrome into the world. And for him, that was a real example of this. Like that people actually do believe that it's okay, right? And he says, my daughter's been the biggest blessing in my life, right? And that to him is the reality of this thought experiment, I think. Okay, I'm going to try to cover the last one kind of quickly, and then Garrett's going to look at like evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. So this is going back, if y'all were here last week, that's Simone Weil, who was kind of a mystic that said, like, I just experienced God. So philosophers have this idea, because of what I talked about last week, that things are so hard to prove, that we often just choose to live with what we consider basic beliefs. So are we in the matrix right now? A lot of technology people think one day, I don't know if it's 100 years, 500 years, we will have augmented reality and AI so advanced that we actually could have artificial reality that's so realistic you wouldn't know if you were in it or not. If that ever becomes possible, how would you know? You can't prove it 100%, right? If it's so realistic you can't tell the difference, there's no such thing as evidence, because anything that would be evidence of the real world is mirrored in the simulation, right? How do you know God didn't create you 5 minutes ago and just implant all of your past memories in your brain? You can't prove it, right? I mean, if God gave you the memories, you would have the memories. How would you know, right? How do I know that you have an actual mind, you're a real person with consciousness, and that you're not just a convincing fake? You know, you can't prove it, but we all believe it, right? Like, to function in the world, it's a basic belief that history exists, the real external world exists, other people exist with minds. And for some people, the universe just doesn't make sense without God, right? They feel like they have felt the presence of God, right? They have felt the love of God. Now, as a philosophical argument, it's sort of hard to convince somebody else that they have a God-shaped hole in their heart if they don't want to believe that. But if you feel like you felt it, and you just say, God is just a basic belief to me, that's okay. Like, you don't have to feel ashamed of how much evidence you have of everything you believe, right? I mean, you will never have evidence that you're not in the Matrix. I'm sorry, you just won't. And if you just feel like God is the fundamental fabric of how you make sense of the world, and you have felt Him, you have known His love, it can be a basic belief. It's just one of the things that is part of your reality. Okay, so I know you can't read all of this, but Garrett built this argument map, and he's going to talk a little bit about thinking about Jesus and the resurrection.
Okay, so I am taking an apologetics class, which is the logical defense of the faith. And the thing we started out with was historical evidence for God and Jesus. And so we've already talked a lot about God. And so I wanted to throw in this about Jesus because I worked really hard on it and I think it's pretty cool. But what it is trying to prove the resurrection, because we know Jesus existed. We have evidence from everybody, people that could be biased, like the disciples, people that obviously could not, like the Romans. We have many Roman historical accounts of Jesus, and everything that's in the Bible is said by them. So we just assume, or we believe it happened because we have all this evidence. And so the thing then is, did Jesus rise again? Because if He did, it proves that we already know He did all these things, and on top of that, He was the Son of God and He rose again. Or did He not rise again, and somehow the disciples have fabricated this, or something has messed it up in their heads, and we've just been believing this elaborate lie that Jesus rose again. And so this is basically the proof that we're not believing an elaborate lie, that it did actually happen. And so there's three possible ways you could believe that after Jesus rose from the dead, the disciples responded. You could say, number one, the disciples told the truth. They saw Jesus rose, they saw the Son of God coming back to life, and they told everybody, they told the truth. Number two is they lied. For some reason, Jesus did not come back, and they thought it would be a great idea to lie to the entire world and devote the rest of their lives to this lie, that their leader came back to life. And the last possibility, out of all the possibilities, is that somehow the disciples themselves were deceived. They believed that Jesus came back even though He didn't. So those are the three possibilities. And this proves that they told the truth. And so this is the kind of pyramid, or like brick by brick, proving that there were reliable eyewitnesses that told the truth. And I'll get to that in a second. But first I want to start with the two opposing beliefs. They lied or they were deceived. And so starting with they were not deceivers, or they are not liars. The real thing is, like, both the audience and the speaker, just starting with number one, the thing that I found the most convincing is that you really get to see for the rest of the disciples' and apostles' lives, they spent every waking moment devoting themselves to Christ and God. And if they had just decided for some reason to get fame or something, that they would just lie to the world and say Jesus came back, they all died pretty terrible deaths at a fairly young age after devoting years of their life to this. And that's the speaker problem, that it can't explain why the apostles would have lied. It can't explain why the apostles would have basically sold their lives to Christ. It can't explain why they would have died for him. They can't have, it just doesn't make sense that they lied and then did these extreme things for it. And so, going on to the deceived, to deceive the apostles, there's only a few things that could have happened. One, there could have been a Jesus doppelganger that just randomly showed up and said, "Hi guys, I rose again." They could have been in so much psychological pain after losing their teacher that all their minds were just like basically destroyed, and they just started believing this, or somehow they were on drugs and hallucinating that Jesus rose again. And so the thing is that none of these can really ever be full arguments or can ever really even make that much sense. There's no reason to believe there's a Jesus doppelganger. And also, I'm sure we've all seen twins and even identical twins. And if you spend a long time, you get to know the difference between them. And so I'm sure that the disciples who spent years following Jesus would know the difference between a random doppelganger that showed up. So that just doesn't make sense. I'm sure that it was very psychologically damaging to see their teacher die, but to have all the disciples, and on top of that, there was even more people that saw Jesus come back rather than just the disciples, just to have them all randomly start hallucinating out of psychological pain just doesn't really make sense or hold up under any like serious thought. And also, they probably weren't hallucinating on any drugs or anything about Jesus. And so they can have been deceived by others, like a doppelganger, and it just doesn't really make sense that they hallucinated it. And there's also evidence that people who have hallucinated have clearly been able to tell when they're hallucinating. And once they've woken up, they can say that they knew what they saw was a hallucination, that they could tell the difference. So if the disciples did hallucinate Jesus rising, and then they later stopped hallucinating, they would have been able to tell, and they wouldn't have devoted their lives to following just a hallucination. And then the pyramid is the most important because it proves the reliability of the Bible and why we should believe that when the Bible says there are eyewitnesses that told the truth that Jesus rose, we should believe it. And the thing on the left, the Christian evidence, there's two things. One is the reliability of Luke and how he's a reliable historian, that everything he says in the Bible we can believe as basically if a historian had wrote it rather than just a biblical author. But the thing on the far left is by far the most interesting and convincing to me, and the thing I want to highlight, and that is Paul's conversion. And so if you think about everything I've said so far, it's really focused on that couple of days with the disciples and Jesus' death, right? There's a couple of things that could have happened, but Paul was converted after Jesus had risen into heaven. And so if Jesus was just this random dude, this normal man who died and never rose again, how would he have converted Paul? And it's not like the disciples could have bribed Paul to just randomly come to their side and pretend to be a Christian. Paul was one of the most intense opponents of Christianity. Paul stoned Christians. He was one of the most educated Jewish leaders and strongly opposed everything the Christians stood for. And so to see him have a 180 turn in his life in the span of like one day on the road to Damascus, it just doesn't make sense. There must be a cause that caused him to change his whole life around. And that cause must be Jesus. There's no way a hallucination, like I've already mentioned, could change someone's life like that. And also there's accounts that what happened on the road to Damascus wasn't just something Paul saw, but it was more of a public event that everyone traveling with Paul saw, that this miraculous thing happened. And the thing with Paul's eyes, there's evidence that he was never really able to see quite right again, and that he had to, he never actually really wrote any of his letters, that he had scribes write it for him, and his signature is like extremely large so that he could read his own signature. So there's little things like that that just added up with the absurdity that someone as intense as Paul would just like decide to change sides. It just shows that Jesus really did come again and rise again, and he really did just have an influence. And so you can see I added non-Christian evidence because in apologetics it's important to get both the bias and the non-biased perspectives, because that leads to the most powerful argument. And so I'm not really going to go through that as much, but it's just basically say there's biblical and historical evidence that's like archaeological, that basically states what Luke said was true and that what Jesus did was true. So there's no reason to disbelieve that. The only thing that's in question is whether or not Jesus rose. And we've just proved that there's a very, the only logical thing to believe is that Jesus rose, basically. And so.
Thanks, Garrett.
Yeah.
All right, I need to let y'all go. I think next week we're going to talk about free will, which I think is one of the hardest problems in philosophy, and I love it. And so I hope y'all are here. It should be fun. Thanks.